Thank you very, very much for coming. My name is Mary Harper and I'm Africa editor at the BBC World Service. And we're here today to celebrate World Humanitarian Day and the whole spirit of humanitarianism. After this event, as I'm sure many of you know, there's going to be a memorial service for humanitarian workers at Westminster Abbey, so you're all welcome to proceed there after this event. And we have some very special people here on this panel who are going to share in an informal way their personal experiences of the rewards, the challenges, the dangers of being a humanitarian worker. And of working in this field and how it's changed over the decades. So we're going to also hope to hear from our online audience, of which there are about, I think, more than 170 people are also engaged with us from all over the world, and of course you here. And there'll be plenty of opportunity to share your thoughts and questions later on. And also, please, if you can, tweet your own stories and thoughts and questions using the hashtag #AidStories, but also keep your phones on silent while you're doing that. And before we start, please allow me to introduce this panel. To my right here is Sara Pantuliano, who is the director of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at the ODI. And as I know from being a journalist, Sara is someone who often comments and speaks publicly on these issues, and she's particularly an expert in conflict and post-conflict situations. As well as that, she's the managing director of disasters and also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Risk and Resilience. So thanks very much, Sara. And to Sara's right, there is Imran Madan, who he's head of the Humanitarian Department at Islamic Relief Worldwide, and he's also worked for Islamic Relief in Sudan, in Bosnia, Kosovo, and has been their UK manager. And before that, he also worked for Muslim Aid. So thank you very much for coming. To my left is Al-Khudur Dalum, MBE, and I'm delighted. When I said that I was going to be on a panel with you, I received a lot of jealous remarks from people I know. And Al-Khudur has more than 25 years' experience in humanitarian work. He was working for Safer World as Director of Programs for Africa and the Middle East, and also worked for Save the Children, the Sudanese government, and the ODA, which is now DFID. And further along the panel, there's Charlie Gamal, who worked with the ICRC in Afghanistan as a Pashto and Dari interpreter, and now is writing a book about the history of the city of Herat. And then at the end is Katie Atfield, who was head of disaster management at the British Red Cross. And she's worked as a humanitarian worker in more than 30 countries across the world. She's a specialist in emergency and crisis response, and also in security management and civil military coordination. So thanks very much, all of you, for coming. And I think if we could start, the idea is to keep this quite informal, not too rigid. And I think it would be interesting to hear from all of you, maybe you first, Katie, about why you became a humanitarian in the first place. What was it that motivated you to get involved? Was it a mistake? Was it something you've been planning to do for your whole life?
Oh, I don't know. Somewhere in between. I think I was an idealist. Probably a fairly foolish young idealist. Wanted to change the world. I think at the time it was a choice between wildlife conservation and humanitarian, and I got offered that job first. So if you call that an accident, it's an accident. But I think it was also, something that a lot of us don't like to admit, which is I probably had some fairly serious problems in my own life at the time, and thought I'd rather deal with the problems of the world than deal with my own. And there's always that aspect of thinking, are we running away from something or are we running towards something? And it's probably only recently that I've really fully kind of come to terms and admitted a lot of this stuff to myself. Although in my early missions, we always had a joke about which of three categories are you? And some of my fellow panelists will remember this, and I guess some other people as well. It was, you were one of the three W's. You were, three M's, sorry. One of the three M's. You were a mercenary, a missionary, or a misfit. And those are the reasons why you became an aid worker.
And I think, Sarah, you said there were four M's.
There's a fourth one.
Somebody argued that, you could also be a misanthrope somehow and still become a humanitarian, but I think that was a joke.
It's like the three monkeys and the extra one, isn't it? Yeah.
So, what about me? I think it was part by chance, part by design, really, because I set out to go to Sudan when I was really young. I was 21, and that was part of my first degree dissertation. In Italy, we do our first degree by research as well. And I don't know why, I really was determined. I was enamored with the whole idea of studying Sudan in particular. And so I went out to do research on the impact that, urban adaptation had on gender dynamics of a pastoralist group that had been displaced by drought in the 80s. So, I stayed in Khartoum for a couple of months, but was driving out every day to, the outskirts of Omdurman for 50, 60 kilometers, and fell completely in love with Sudan and the Sudanese, in particular, and I was really determined to continue to live and work there. And so then I went back home. My first degree was in politics, and decided to pursue my academic studies in development studies, actually, to start with. So I did an MA in development studies and then a PhD, but all focused on Sudan because I wanted to go back and live there. And then, of course, the easiest way to go back to Sudan also to do research was through an aid organization. So joining an aid organization was a way to continue to live there, and and sort of in a way I started through a development organizations, but almost by mistake ended up working in the Nuba Mountains. It was actually a boss at UNDP that decided that I knew enough about Eastern Sudan and working with pastoralists and development, I could learn something new, and decided I should go and lead the operation in the Nuba Mountains, without really having worked in a conflict before.
And what about you, Alfred? What was it that got you started in this line of work?
I was actually a graduate of economics in the mid-80s and influenced very much by Julius Nyerere, Nkrumah, and I would like to take 3 months break to fight the IMF and the World Bank for the mess they made about the structural adjustment policies in Africa. So I went to my village and I decided to take 3 months break from the university, and then I go to work to do my task. And when I went to the village, there's a big famine in Darfur.
Darfur, that's where you're from?
Yes, I am from Darfur, where if you heard about it and if you read, Alex Dewar wrote his book, Famine That Kill, where we lost almost about 100,000 people. Wendy Fenton, she was leading or co-leading a major response at that time in Darfur. In every place where you have a distribution center, there is a cemetery, because when the people reach the distribution center, they die there, and there is no place. But when I went to my village, and then I couldn't recognize my village. One thing that in the village I love is the sunset, because during the sunset, that is the beauty of it. You smell the best food, because people are cooking their dinner. You see all the cows coming to meet, and then there's a lot of noise, the horses, donkeys. The village is full of life, and I couldn't recognize that because there's very sad sunset. Everything is sad in the village. So I spent my first week, I couldn't tolerate it the second week, and I found that the 3 months cannot be done like this because it's basically everything sad. And then I decided to go to Niala, and still with my aim to fight, to go for the structural adjustment and everything. But when I reached Niala, I found many agencies trying to do something good for the people of Darfur. And I just walked into Save the Children offices, and I said, do you have a job? They said to me, are you looking for? I said, I'm not looking for a job, but actually I'm looking to help. And they said to me, we interview you. They interviewed me and they took me for the job at that time. And since then, I became addicted. I went to so many rehabilitation homes to treat me out of the addiction, and I couldn't get out of it. That is the story.
And you're still addicted now?
I think so. I will not regret I have done it, to be honest with you. And if it is back again, I will do it again.
And Shirley, what about you? Because you're now writing a book about history. Does that mean that you've stopped being addicted?
No, I don't think it does. I think I had a slightly sort of strange route in. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do job-wise. This was when I was sort of 24, 25, and I'd done a few things, and I thought, gosh, Iran looks quite interesting. So I just went to Iran and started learning Persian and started reading as much as I could about the history, about the politics, about the culture, but as much as I could. And I got sort of, my Persian was actually, after a while, it was quite good. I travelled around Iran. I thought, gosh, I really like being here. And I came back to England and I sort of thought, tried to get back to Iran to go to university, but couldn't. And a friend said, oh, they're looking for Persian interpreters in Afghanistan. I had really no idea. I thought, okay, all right, I'll go and have a look. So I went to Geneva, did the interviews, and actually I had really, shamefully, I didn't really have that much idea about the Red Cross, about what they were doing, and my interview, I think they wanted to take me because I could speak Persian and they didn't have that many Persian interpreters at the time. But the guy interviewing me was clearly sort of shocked that I knew so little about the ICRC. So anyway, so I did some reading up and got the job, and I think what I found fascinating as a historian, as someone who likes languages, was that you get to, particularly the ICRC, you get to see that conflict in Afghanistan. Totally, you get an amazing vantage point because you speak to prisoners, you speak to Americans, you speak to Afghan government, you speak to Taliban about a whole range of subjects. And at the same time, you get to do some really amazing things for people. You get to help people who've lost, who've been separated from their families. And that combination was incredibly intoxicating. You know, the combination of having a point of view which no one else has, and because of the languages, you're right at the front. And then was given an opportunity to learn Pashto with the ICRC, which I took, and then sort of moved into working on my own, sort of less as an interpreter, but more on my own. And yeah, I think it's that opportunity to be able to see a country at a particular time in its evolution or its history. From an amazing vantage point, which not many other people get, and I think particularly with the Red Cross, Kate will probably say the same thing, that it is a unique organisation, and I really found that fascinating. And on top, the being able to influence people's lives in a positive way, and I think it surprised me actually how much I enjoyed it. I think I went there probably slightly mercenary. I went there just to sort of get the language better and understand a little bit more about Afghanistan. I actually, over time, sort of realised, gosh, this is an extraordinary thing. But I mean, I've been combining it with academic work. I think when the book is finished, I'll probably shift back into it. No, it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
And Imran, what about you?
Well, actually, one of the tweets at the beginning was mine. It was a tweet about being a geography student. I studied geography at university, and of course, naturally, geography covers units on development and others that are related. And one of the units was delivered by somebody, I can't remember the connections, but it was somebody with very close connections to CAFOD. May have been involved as a volunteer or whatever, but I remember there was a lot of CAFOD stuff. It was actually a Catholic teacher training college, so it wasn't surprising. But I was thinking, yeah, that's actually a really interesting career. And just because of the way it was taught and the idea that, through NGO work, something could be done about poverty at a very simple level. That was probably the first time it struck me that something could be done. And actually, when I graduated, I don't know how it happened, but I got into, I was working in banking insurance in Mayfair for Lloyd's Bank Insurance Services. So I don't quite know how the initial enthusiasm for aid work had me working in Mayfair. Not particularly happy. But
and how did you make the leap from Mayfair
well, there you go.
to humanitarian work?
Well, actually, I became a Muslim. I converted to Islam when I was 23. And
Why did you do that?
that's not one of your questions. It's not on your list.
I'm a journalist.
Well, actually,
You don't have to answer.
Because I did a joint honours in geography and history, so I thought I knew my history, and in my workplace, in my insurance company, there were a couple of Muslim guys, and we argued the toss about Islamic history in Europe, and were people converted at the end of a sword and stuff like that. And I was quite so I think it was through that, and then I think one of them said, actually, every Saturday, 3 o'clock, London Central Mosque, there's a talk by Yusuf Islam. Now, for the older generation, Yusuf Islam is Cat Stevens. And then I went to see a few talks, and this was at the time of the Salman Rushdie kind of furore, and it was a really interesting, quite a difficult time, but a very interesting time. There was a lot of passion, a lot of views expressed, very divergent views. And I called him afterwards, and I said, Yusuf, I became Imran, and I said, I'm Imran, and I'm interested in, because I knew he was chair of Muslim Aid. And he said, actually, there's a job coming up, you might want to apply for it. And that was the lead-in. So, and I thought, naturally, because of my background in geography, I thought it might be useful, and it was to a degree. So I did that for 2 or 3 years, mainly in the operational side. I asked the trustees if they'd support me to do a master's, and they said no. So I said, fine. So I signed up to do a master's in development studies at Bath University. And I got everything sorted out. I'd got my accommodation sort of semi-sorted out, and I'd been there 2 or 3 times to do a few recce's to make sure I was ready. And then I phoned an old friend of mine called Khalid Roy, who was a neighbour of mine in Ealing. Khalid Roy was working at, I think, SCF in maybe Darfur in the late 80s. I don't know if you met him.
Together, yes.
Yes. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do this master's, and I think that's going to be on my routine. And he went, it was a pause, and he went, that is a complete waste of time, an utter waste of time. What you need to do is get the aid experience. Get the aid experience first, then, based on what your experience is, then do a kind of much more specific master's on, program management or water and sanitation, that sort of thing. And I went, yeah, it's easier said than done. He went, actually, we've just got funding from the ODA, as it was in those days, for a project in El Obeid in Sudan, in North Kordofan, and you'd be ideal for it. And that was the job interview. So I started, telling them about I'm going to do a master's in Bath, and I ended up being semi-offered a job. I had an interview, but it was pretty much, they went, yeah, fine, you start next month. So
Great.
I took the family off to Sudan, and I was there for 2 years.
Thank you very much. And Katie, if you had to pick 1 or 2 of the greatest challenges you faced in your work as a humanitarian, and also a couple of the most rewarding times, what would they be?
Oh, yeah. This is a question that's asked us all the time, either by your Aunt Elsie, oh, how is it, dear? What's your favourite place? And I go, I don't know what my favourite place is, but it's true. There are. What are the big? I suppose the biggest challenge is that no matter how big the organisation, no matter how well appointed the sort of humanitarian operation that you're involved in is, it's whatever you do is never enough. In fact, it never really scratches the surface. Most of what's done is done, despite your best efforts, by other people, because it's done by the people themselves, who, funnily enough, are usually the most resilient, far more so than we are, for all our best intentions. So you're always feeling like you're not doing enough, you're not really achieving what you set out to, and the other side is always stronger than you, whether it's the warring parties who are, vastly more powerful, or whether it's even in a relatively so-called straightforward natural disaster situation, Mother Nature is more powerful than us too. So you're very often feeling a bit, underwhelming and inadequate about what you're doing. But
has there ever been a time when you felt that you've almost had to give up, or you've been defeated because the other side?
Well, I don't think so, because
more powerful.
that's where that's where if none of your rehab session's work, you're still an obsessive. You're still convinced and convicted for these humanitarian principles that you believe in so powerfully. And that, so no, you don't want to, no, you're not going to give up, even though you perhaps know that you should do, and that maybe your own, you're in some ways a person like myself, having moved around a lot, worked in loads of different countries, done mostly emergency work. So there was never any possibility of settling down in one place, having a family. That just didn't, wasn't possible. I was in a different continent 3 times a year. So, but no, I was never going to give it up.
And what about rewarding times that you've really felt?
Well, the rewards are the small ones, aren't they? It's the single child that you manage to find their parents, or the single family who come particularly afterwards to say thank you or whatever it is. I mean, it's those sort of relatively small things. I guess, there are professional rewards, like we all have our memories of particular times. Like for me, there are a few. It's sort of setting up the ICRC's first ever large-scale cash programme, which ended up being 10% of the economy of the West Bank and Gaza. That was an amazing achievement, and it wasn't just mine, it was a whole team of people, as it always is. Or managing to persuade WFP to change their policy in Liberia on how they delivered food in order to try and stop quite so many people getting killed for their food aid. Or so there are big things that you sort of think, that I had a small part to play in that, and that was great, and it really made a difference. But as I say, a lot of the time it's the little things, it's the individual successes and the individual people that you meet.
And what about you, Al-Fadur, in terms of times that you felt particularly challenged, and also times when you felt that, when you look back on your long career, that have been particularly rewarding?
I think when I joined the humanitarian sector, at that time, we joined as national staff. And here I would like really to commend all my fellow national staff across the globe in this day. They are real heroes, and they contributed significantly to the humanitarian. And if you look internationally, you'll find the percentage even in a big organization of international staff is by far less than 10%, 90% constitute. For us, the biggest challenge, is how I maintain my integrity. I am, say, for example, from Darfur. Should I exaggerate the needs so that my community get the support? Or should I reflect the real situation? That is an issue of an integrity. Start from that basic thing. From emotional point of view, I would like my community to benefit. I would like my community to get the benefit out of it. So that is a real exercise. And we had a very hard talks as a national staff. We want to get the right situation, how to reflect it in our reports, how to communicate it to external audiences. That is one. The second one, how you maintain that the standards, which is agreed internationally by us as a national staff, when even the international staff are far away, and if we compromise the operation, they will not be able to know about it. How you maintain your integrity on that issue, how you push that standards. And it is very hard also, because you will find that there are the international standards and your own government, which politically you might agree with or politically you disagree with, you need to maintain those. And for a national staff is absolutely a big struggle. The third one, we want not to be treated as third-class citizens in the humanitarian sector. We as an international, we want to be treated as equal. And we want to show them that, yes, you might have an international perspective exposure, but we have also we bring something to the plate. That is a challenge. And that cultural bridges, how you build those cultural bridges. At the beginning, it starts with the confrontation types of things. And that could bring the whole sector down. How you do that and how you overcome that. And until this today, It is still there, but it's not at the time where we are, because now people were exposed and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
So,
I wanted to ask how much you think it's changed in terms of the national staff being given more recognition, more respect. I mean, they're often the people really at the front line, and as you say, it's their own communities that are the communities that are suffering. Do you think that the international headquarters staff are more sensitive and aware and respectful of that?
I think when people like me, I came to move now, I classify myself as international staff, but still my home base is a national staff. I mean, and many others that they have made their way into the humanitarian sector. Those have helped those organizations to understand better on how to conduct the business with the national staff, how to perform that. I have to say that until today, there is a discrepancies. There are no consistency across the globe, but the standards have improved significantly in all organizations, whereby people are expected to conduct themselves in a way that give respect, dignity to the national staff and their voices to be heard in their own institutions. And I recall very well at the beginning, when we started challenging our own organization, there are some stuff, no, this is for the white people, for the other, forget, leave it for them, we are not that. But I said, no, this is our organization, this is the sector. We are talking, we are for the cause. We are not coming here to worship an organization. We want to make a change. And if we want to make a change, and we felt that, but also from our side, we need to be open. Because also, no, this cannot be done because the culture and so on and so forth. No, you can challenge those cultures. And that is what we get from the other side, taking the status quo, taking everything. No, it cannot be changed. Don't talk about this, and so on and so forth. And actually, that is an opening eye for me. I mean, I learned a lot for you to be tolerant, multicultural, and everything. That is also a journey for us, for our national staff to move that way. But I want to mention, in terms of the challenges you have mentioned, about one of the things that when you are doing humanitarianism, also you need to be conscious about the longer term development. How your intervention is fit in the medium to longer term development. That is a real challenge for me. Because as I said to you, I am a person that is very much influenced to challenge the structural adjustment policies, the macroeconomic policies, the longer term development, and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying the structural adjustment policies are wrong. They are right, but the packaging is also the same way like the humanitarianism, whereby having the national perspective and the local perspective were not taken by the experts, and therefore they got it wrong. The same thing for the humanitarianism. I see it is relief to development continuum. That is very critical, and how you be conscious that when you are doing that intervention, you are actually not upsetting the trends for development. You are not creating a momentum that will take things out of context. So those are really challenge for me and for a number of my fellow national staff, and especially in Africa.
Thank you very much. And Charlie, as somebody who wasn't a national staff but was very much on the front line as a translator and being bombarded with all of these different sides and interest groups, was that something that you found difficult? And how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I think actually I was just noting one of these challenges actually is neutrality, particularly in the conflict context. If you're working for the Red Cross, what I was doing in East Afghanistan, working a lot with Taliban and Al-Qaeda on the way they conduct hostilities so as to minimize civilian casualties. And that, so 2 points. Firstly, that I felt that I think my neutrality was, it's challenged. I mean, we accept this principle of neutrality sort of without really questioning it, but I think in those contexts it really did challenge it, because I was thinking, here am I sitting opposite someone who's possibly responsible for some quite horrible things, and we're having to talk to him not only about the way in which they conduct hostilities, but also we do first aid training, we do their mortar remains transfers. I mean, we work a lot with them, which is sort of embodying the principle of neutrality, but I think that forced me to question that principle a lot. I mean, I would always come up with the, I was okay with it because of the context you're working in and the good you're doing in this particular context. And actually it was really nice to be able to make some progress on issues of suicide bombs and the way they conduct hostilities, assassinations, so as to try and hopefully that in a few situations, fewer civilians might die, or they don't do so many assassinations. And I think there were instances in which we made tangible progress on that. But then that neutrality goes totally the other way. So you're having exactly the same conversations with Americans and Afghans. So you really embody this principle of neutrality. And I think my neutrality was just as tested when I was speaking to American military commanders who'd been responsible for civilian casualties on a similar level to Taliban counterparts. So I think that was very interesting. And I think as an interpreter, you're put in some quite delicate situations. That's why the Red Cross uses expat interpreters, because they don't want to put, say in the context I was in, they don't want to put an Afghan with, the Afghan intelligence chief or whoever it is, or the Americans or this or that, because that person would be in a very vulnerable position. So it was a unique position, I think, and I think, but at the same time, if I felt very keenly the pressure from the national staff that my language was perfect, because if ever I got anything wrong in a translating situation or even in a social situation, it would be picked up on very quickly, because they think, well, you're supposed to be here, you're supposed to be the interpreter. And when I first got to Afghanistan, my Persian was probably not as good as it could have been. And I found that situation, that was a huge challenge, constantly being, are they gonna pick me up on that, because that's something that they could do. But yeah, it's interesting, because you are the first line of when someone comes into the office with a story about an airstrike or something or whatever. They go straight to you, and that's always. And I used to envy the delegates who I was interpreting for, who could sometimes, as I did occasionally when I was a delegate, sort of sit there and just drift off for a couple of minutes and wait for the interpreter. You're always on.
And Sarah, in terms of the whole world of humanitarianism and how over the years it's changed, have you noticed any particular sort of salient changes? Do you think now that some of the organisations are too big and bureaucratic in terms of the headquarters outside the countries, and that maybe they're even hampering the efforts of the frontline staff?
Well, I mean, the change has been massive, of course. I mean, I remember when I started in Sudan, I was in a location that was so remote that I wasn't in touch with, well, not even headquarters, but even Khartoum. For weeks. I mean, I had to go back to the closest location where we had, a field base to communicate by radio, and you would get about a third of what you were communicating by radio anyway, which of course had pros and cons. It meant, you were entirely in charge, and it was, entirely up to you what you were doing. You didn't have to check and get approval and, permission. You could ask for forgiveness afterwards, but ultimately, you didn't really have to ask for permission. But on the other hand, it also meant that whenever you had a problem, you were on your own. And I did have many problems along my career. I mean, many times, I ended up being stranded in the middle of nowhere. We had a breakdown of cars. We got lost. We had to walk for days. We had no water. No, security security conditions that would not be tolerated today. So it's been a bit of, sort of a difficult balance to strike. If you want, 20 years ago, the spirit, the passion, the individual, if you want, entrepreneurship of each aid worker was central to how they conducted themselves in the field, and that had a positive element, but it also left it open to a lot of, if you want, chancing it on a daily basis. We definitely go better in terms of standards. We definitely go better in terms of duty of care towards staff. There is still, I think, a lot that remains to be done. I think particularly in terms of dealing with the trauma and the stress in terms of mental health of a lot of colleagues who are frontline aid workers. I don't think we're there in any way. I think people that work in the conditions that Katie and Al-Hidayah were talking about, on a daily basis in very difficult environment, which really take a toll personally, in and particularly national colleagues who very often have families involved in these conflicts or disasters, so they have a personal as well as a professional, struggle to operate in these environments, but also being exposed to loss of life because of wounds, because of starvation on a daily basis, the difficulty of not having your support network around you, your friends, your family. It's really, really hard, and I don't think as organizations we've really, in general, in the sector, got completely on top of how we can really support our colleagues, sort of deal and recover from these experiences. But more generally, whilst there have been, improvements, in terms of the way in which we do business, the bureaucratization, I would say, the corporatization almost of aid, is probably gone too far. And it's not across the piece for everyone. There are still organizations that, are able to, strike a healthier balance. But ultimately, that is the trend. And I think that.
In what way have they gone too far? In terms of
because I think the priorities that dictate a number of the choices on the ground are the priorities of what is more almost like the way you run a corporate, what is good for business rather than what is good for the people we're supposed to serve. And that, of course, completely alters what should be the driving force of why we are humanitarians. When our marketing or comms or fundraising departments dictate what we should say and how, what we should do and where, that ultimately is wrong. And I think the fact that performances of senior managers in UN agencies as in NGOs are judged by how you grow the business, how many staff you have, how your budget increases. It's totally wrong. It's not judged on the quality of what you do, how you serve people, what you do to really make sure that you are able to offer a contribution in terms of saving lives and protecting livelihoods. That is how performance should be rewarded. That's not the case. And what this has also led to is a lot of can-do attitude and really an increasingly risk-averse attitude on the ground, because ultimately nobody wants bad news. You don't want reputational risk. You don't want the risk that something goes wrong for your organization, and that has an impact on your risk appetite locally. So you do stuff that is safe, but that is not always what is right or is best, locally. You stifle the creativity of your staff very often in terms of what they could do, because while we haven't really tried that before, we're not sure, you shouldn't really do stuff that's not been standardized. And that happens a lot. And I think it's time that we try and rebalance that a little bit on the ground, because that is also immensely frustrating for frontline staff to actually know that ultimately there are other ways of doing things that will be much better, much faster, easier, more appropriate, but they have almost a daily battle with the headquarters to make sure that they are allowed to actually follow other their instincts of what they know would work better. But I think we are in a very interesting sort of phase today where, also because of the politicization that we were hearing about and the challenges to neutrality, the way in which we've done business over the last 10 years is increasingly questioned. The sector as a whole, its legitimacy, unfortunately, is more and more questioned on the ground. And so we are in a phase where we really need to rethink, in which way we work with communities, who, how frontline staff can operate, and how organizations, need to change their behaviors to make sure that they continue to be able to work in conflict in particular.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, if you allow me, I really want to make an intervention. I think the landscape changed completely, and there are some positive things in these changes, like the technology. I recall that if I have this technology in 1986 when we are working, definitely will make a big difference for us in that. The access to media and transparency and reaching out to the public, for example, reaching to the public whom we are working with, definitely will make a difference. But I think that also when at the time when we are working is guided by principles, not guiding by processes, systems, structures, and so on and so forth. And processes, systems, structures are good, but when you want to be too safe to the level that you want to tick the boxes, and get your salary at the end of the month, then you compromise a lot of things. And I just, before coming here, I tried to look at the innovations came out of the humanitarian responses in the 1980s and to at least until mid-90s, and the innovation from mid-90s to this after that. And actually, I can say that the innovation is under questions coming out of humanitarian. For example, the household economy analysis. I witnessed that household economy analysis came as a result of after people distributing food and not trying to talk to what is actually the household need, how the household dynamic is operating. The IDTR, identification, documentation, tracing and relocation, came out of the Rwanda genocide. After Rwanda genocide, people how to trace those mass people were got just in the middle of that. But the people have not said to can you give us the manual and so on. So no one asked for the manual. And they came with the whole IDTR. So the number of innovation, I was asking myself, what is the innovation coming right now? It's actually under question, and that is, I think, because playing it safe, so many prescriptive, and the corporate life of that. Commercialization of aid is benefit in terms of borrowing the private values of the private sector, but the values of the private sector are not all suitable for running humanitarian business. Militarization of aid is good in the Ebola. In the Ebola, I commend the military, but I think the military to do a humanitarian response, it bring a lot of things, and this is coming new. So I just want to throw that in addition to what Sarah said.
Yeah, thank you very much. And before we open it to the floor, Imran, in terms of you're now somebody who's head of a department in the UK dealing with staff on the front line, have you managed to avoid some of these pitfalls? Do you think that your organisation and others are simply becoming too corporate, too bureaucratic?
I would say, most, if they're honest, and most are, and I think, we are becoming much more, transparent and accountable nowadays. But I think most organisations would admit that they have to avoid becoming a kind of, a self-feeding monster that just has that kind of upward graph that shows more and more income, against more and more, as Hida was saying, tick boxes. So I think that is a challenge, and because there isn't a direct correlation with program quality. I mean, it's more money doesn't necessarily mean better program delivery, and I think there are huge challenges there. And how many CEOs have that as a big chunk of their objectives for a year ahead? I mean, very few are told, actually, we don't mind a 10 million drop-off, it's okay, but as long as you get the program quality, it's sorted out. I don't think there are many under that in that situation. So I think that's a challenge for any organisation, and we as an organisation, I think we've gone from 100 to 125, 150, 175 million sterling, and we're like thinking, whoa, this is good, but it's really... And we have a situation we were working out how many of our staff are kind of in interim and sort of secondment situations because we've got so much, growth of programs. Are we recruiting enough staff? And that's a major challenge. We were talking before, Kate and I, that that's one of the big challenges for any organisation is to recruit quality staff. French-speaking staff or Francophone Africa is a really incredible challenge. So I think that really is something that we need to check and to ensure that we're doing enough at the program delivery end. And I think we've got issues of duty of care. I think we as an organisation, again we were talking before, and I feel slightly uncomfortable when in Yemen. We're very quick to get the expats out. Again, that's under duty of care, and that's fair enough. We get them out to Eritrea or wherever, or flying out, and one or two stay behind to hand over to the national staff. And then I feel, okay, what are we doing for the national staff? Are we doing enough? We have a very, very, detailed security program that allows national staff to work from home. But a lot of our staff working in Gaza last year lost their homes. I mean, their homes were completely destroyed. So they had to move their families, and they worked right throughout the crisis. And we're recognising some of their contributions tomorrow in our own kind of internal celebration about contribution of aid workers, and like a number of organisations, a lot of our meeting rooms are named after staff who were killed in the field. I've been to a number of organisations, and they do the same thing. They just to remember those staff. And we've got staff who were killed by snipers, who were killed in car crashes, who were killed in by sort of armed factions. We don't quite know which side, but so I'm always in awe of those staff that are working under incredibly difficult circumstances, and I feel, I have to say, a little bit of a fraud sometimes. I feel, when we get recognition, we do like to make reference to those staff in the field. And actually, one of the key influences in my life as a role model was Dr. Hani al-Banna, who was the original kind of CEO of Islamic Relief, and there was always something that he taught us, and he still reminds us of this. Whenever he tried, he came in, he'd have many ideas about new programs, and he'd say, right, tomorrow I want you to go to this country and I want you to set up a new program. Tomorrow. Get on that aeroplane and do it. Of course we'd go, well, Dr. Hani is very difficult, there's the resource issues and we haven't done the security. And then you look at him and his just eyebrows would just start to go up, as if to say, are you giving me this cock and bull story about it's not possible? Everything is possible. Everything is possible. And you say, go away and think about it and come back. And of course we'd think about it and we've got a few connections, and somebody says, they've got somebody that they know in that area, and there's a local organisation that we can patch that. So I think that everything is possible approach is something that allows us to push back those boundaries. But I think, yes, in answer to your question, I think each organisation has to be really careful about growth. It isn't necessarily advancement.
Thank you very much. And it's now time to open this discussion up to the floor. And please don't forget to tweet stories and questions to #AidStories. And you're welcome to share your own experiences, ask questions, share thoughts. And in terms of when you ask the questions, if you can also say your name and your affiliation. And I'll take them in threes. I think there's one over there, and there's a man here at the front, and then the lady behind.